Okay, I'm very pleased to be here, very pleased and very honored. And I really want to thank Sanjeev and Abhishek for their invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's my first time in South India, and it's beautiful. So I'm going to teach you, that's the aim of the week, to teach you the Bethe-Ansatz, and especially the Bethe-Ansatz applied to non-equilibrium statistical physics, non-equilibrium stat-mech. So I'm going to say probably the same thing that you heard at the beginning of each lecture. The subject I'm going to present is a very wide subject. It has a huge domain of applications, and we all believe in that, and it's true. So the Bethe-Ansatz is indeed a very wide subject. It's a very dry subject also. I'm sorry for that. And many people are working on this mathematical physics domain. And in fact, I'm not a developer of Bethe-Ansatz, I'm a user. I'm somebody who tries to use some of the techniques, part of it, it's a big subject, to try to solve exactly some problems in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So my course will be mixed. Non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and some problems solved using the Bethe-Ansatz. So please also don't be too shy, don't hesitate to interrupt me if there is something you don't understand, and especially if you don't completely understand my bizarre accent. I don't have the typical, probably Indian accent. I have a mixture of Indian and French accent, and sometimes nobody understands what I say in English. So please do stop me if you don't understand certain sounds. So, as I told you, Bethe-Ansatz is a kind of technical, complicated subject. So today we are not going to start with it. I think tomorrow I will really enter into the details. For the moment being, I will start with some very general exposure of something that Satya already told us about, integrability, integrable systems. So, again, it's a theory. I'm not going to enter into it. But integral systems, well, we all know about them. In fact, if I put things in a kind of extreme way, when we learn physics, when we start doing physics, we learn only integrable systems. Because when our teachers teach us the basic models and give us exercises or exams or anything we have to solve, the things that we have to solve are things that are solvable. So they're integrable. So the word integrable, mathematical physicist, a very pure one, would shout at me, but you can take it, as Satya also said, as solvable. So we can multiply the examples. I mean, you all have exactly solvable problems in your brains because you learned them. So I just listed some of them that we all met when we were kids. I don't know, a string with a mass, okay? The force is kx. The pendulum law, x double dot plus omega square theta double dot. Theta is the angle, sine theta is 0. So the equation is not so simple. It's a nonlinear equation. And usually we just linearize it and then get harmonic oscillations. But even if you put the sine function, it remains integrable with elliptic functions and so on. The main clue is that energy is conserved in this model. It's a one-dimensional model, only one variable with conserved energy. So you can calculate everything. What else? Kepler's problem is integrable, Earth and Sun. This is probably the first most important integrable problem ever. And as you know, Newton solved it and found mathematically the elliptic trajectories. And if you go to more complicated celestial bodies, you can have parabolic or hyperbolic motion. All this is known. In thermodynamics, we mostly study the perfect gas, again, because it's exactly solvable. So whatever we learn in thermodynamics, entropy, free energy, we test it on the perfect gas. When we learn electromagnetism or optics, we learn how to calculate the field of a plane, of a cylinder, magnetic field or electric field of these things. We learn diffraction by infinite slit or by a hole which is circular, never the diffraction by a strange triangle or some bizarre form, because nobody knows how to do it. So what else? When we learn quantum mechanics, we learn the hydrogen atom and the harmonic oscillator. And all these things, we can do the calculations completely. And there are more complicated examples that you may have learned or may not have learned. For example, in general relativity, there is this exact solution by Friedman of the metric in general relativity by a spherical, let's say, a star, or you have some Chandrasekhar solutions for black holes. It becomes more and more complicated each time, but it's exactly solvable using more and more elaborate mathematics. Okay, so these are problems that you try to solve in your life, and there is beautiful mathematical structure. Sommerfeld wrote a 4-volume book on the top we play with, so a theory of the top, very complicated mathematics. But, for example, you were never asked, I think, to solve this problem. You have a pendulum here hanging, and you have another one. 2 pendulums. It's not so complicated. I mean, in real life, you could have things like that. But you were never really asked, I imagine. Maybe you did some perturbation theory, but otherwise, nobody showed you the solution of this problem, because even such a simple problem has no simple analytical solution. It's not integrable. Okay? So even the double pendulum, you fail. And of course, one of the most famous non-solvable, non-integrable problem is the 3-body celestial problem. Sun, Earth, and Moon, for example. I mean, you have the Sun, you have the Earth, and you have the Moon around it. There is no exact solution for that. You cannot write the trajectories of these 3 bodies using functions. You cannot find analytical expressions for them. And it's highly non-trivial to prove that you cannot solve it. In fact, the man who was able to show that it was not solvable, you see it's a kind of negative assertion, like for solving higher degree equations higher than 5. It's Poincaré, Henri Poincaré, at the beginning of the 20th century. And the story is quite amusing because he first thought that he could solve it and won a prize for it, for the solution, and then realized that his proof was wrong. And even more than that, he understood why it cannot be solved, and he invented chaos theory for that. All these kind of things that we have seen, these kind of bizarre forms in chaos theory that we call now strange attractors and so on, he invented them to prove that it's not solvable. Okay, so as Satya said, there's a kind of dictionary, which is not proved, between regular motion and integrability and non-regular or chaotic type of motion and non-integrability. But of course, it's not so well separated. And if, of course, I mean, then there is the usual reproach. So I'm going to debunk it from the very beginning. Real life is non-integrable. Anything which is complex enough or has enough degrees of liberty will fall into the big box of non-integrable systems. So you can, from the very beginning, tell me, okay, so I don't need to come to this lecture. I will just skip it, because integrable models are rare, or even worse than rare, they are non-generic. Okay, they are non-generic, it's true, but they are somehow, as I don't know if this same say exists in English, I'm translating from French, they are kind of white stones or gems. So they are special models that you can build your intuition on and then use them as core models to build perturbation theory and to build an understanding. So even though they are not generic, and models which can be solved by Bethe and Zaltz are non-generic, they are extremely special. Even though they are extremely special, they're very useful, because we base our knowledge mostly on them, and then we do some other techniques, approximation techniques, to understand more general models. Okay? So I'm going to talk mostly about integrable systems, and integrable systems for statistical mechanics. So of course, this is a school on statistical mechanics, so I presume you know the basics of it, but you probably know mostly equilibrium statistical mechanics. So let's review very fast. Probably, I mean, I'm not. My aim is not to try to get you bored, but just to My notations may be different from the ones that Abhishek and Sanjeev used last week or that you learned at school. So let's review very fast what is statistical mechanics. Statistical mechanics is a theory who tries to understand macroscopic behavior starting from the microscopic point of view, knowing the laws for 10 to the power 23 bodies. We want to deduce something for just a few degrees of freedom, effective degrees of freedom, pressure, volume, temperature. We want to find macroscopic laws to have an understanding at our scale. Okay? And for example, in hydrodynamics, the same Navier-Stokes equations apply for alcohol and for water. You just have to change the values of viscosity, thermal conductivity, and a few other parameters. Otherwise, you have the same Navier-Stokes equations, although drinking alcohol and drinking water makes a different effect. Okay? So these two liquids are different, especially for your health, but as long as a physicist is interested, they behave quite the same, especially if you place yourself into the same framework, the same Reynolds number. You probably learned about the Reynolds number previous week or even much before. If you have the same Reynolds number, you will see the same behavior. Whether it's alcohol or water or anything else, of course, then you have more complicated non-Newtonian liquids. Honey is different and so on, viscoelasticity. But okay, I mean, if we don't go into the details, you have classes of universality of things, liquids, liquid crystals, solids, and so on, which behave alike when you adjust the parameters well. Okay, so classical thermodynamics and equilibrium statistical mechanics, if we take a system which is at equilibrium at temperature T, whatever it is, a perfect gas or anything, so here we have the system, and it's surrounded by a unique reservoir at temperature T. So if we look at the equilibrium behavior of this object, we know that we can encode it in a few macroscopic parameters, and we can really understand what's happening there by computing a few functions, such as the entropy or the free energy. You know all that. And the basic thing is that to describe such an object, we just need to know that the microscopic configurations, so I will write typically the microscopic configurations as curly C. So this is a configuration made of 10 to the power 23 Avogadro particles. It's an extremely complex object. And statistical mechanics tells us that these configurations are sampled, okay, according to a probability distribution. So it's a probabilistic description of the microscopic behavior, which gives us an effective description at macroscopic scale. And the probability distribution of a configuration is given by the Maxwell-Boltzmann-Gibbs canonical law. If you know the energy of this configuration, you divide it by Boltzmann constant multiplied by temperature, and you normalize this, then this gives you the equilibrium distribution of this configuration, of any configuration. So you take any configuration, and it is sampled according to this probability distribution. So if you wish, and it's becoming more and more the case, theoretical equilibrium statistical mechanics is a branch of probability theory. Okay? So more and more mathematicians are now really working in equilibrium statistical mechanics from the point of view of probability. Okay? And this Z, the partition function, so I have this big disadvantage compared to Satya and many others, is that I can use only half of the blackboard, but okay, I try to do my best. So this partition function is just a sum, because it's a normalization, over all configurations of this exponential minus e over kt. And Boltzmann understood, although he never wrote it like that you can connect this probabilistic object, this StatMech object, you can connect it to thermodynamics. Can you read if I write here? Yeah? Well, it's a very important equation, but you know it. You can connect it to the free energy. If you calculate the log of this partition function and multiply it by minus kT, you reconstruct the thermodynamic free energy of your material. Okay? And then, using that, well, now that you have the free energy, you can deduce using Maxwell relations or whatever you like, the compressibility, all the thermodynamic, the heat capacities, and whatever you wish. And the equation of state and so on. And then the idea is that if you have a macroscopic observable, any observable O, what you see at macroscopic level is the average of this observable with this probability distribution. So what you see is the average of O, which is 1 over Z. You compute O for each configuration, but of course you don't see that because it's much more, it's too microscopic. You just see the average, and the average is just given by this formula, E of Z. And this is the value predicted by thermodynamics. But where statistical mechanics is stronger than thermodynamics is that you have a probability distribution. When you have a probability distribution, you don't have only averages. You have variance, fluctuations. So you also have fluctuations of this variable. I'm not going to write the formula. It's just a fluctuation according to this measure, to this distribution. And these things are the important things predicted by statistical mechanics, which go beyond thermodynamics. In thermodynamics, you have no fluctuations. Okay? So you need StatMech to observe fluctuations. And probably the most important, again, basic model, but not only model, I mean natural phenomenon, where you observe pure fluctuations is Brownian motion. So you learned that. I think Sanjeev taught you Brownian motion, he told me, the previous week. So Brownian motion is really a fluctuating effect where StatMech is at full power, equilibrium StatMech. Okay, so I told you about equilibrium statistical mechanics, about integrable systems, and you probably know what is the basic integrable model in equilibrium statistical mechanics. What is it? So that's one possible description of the Ising model. So these are squares, like in a checkboard. Okay? And I decide to put black or white pawns, like when you play this game, Go or I don't know what, on the checkboard. So black one, white one, and so on. I'm not going to fill all of them, and so on. So you have two types of colors, the black ones and the white ones. Okay, usually you put +1 or -1. It's the same thing, it's a binary variable. You could put 0 and 1, spin up or spin down. It's exactly a change of language. But this is the lattice gas description, which I prefer. No quantum mechanics, purely classical. So no spins. I mean, the Ising model is a classical model, so putting spins in this model is a bit bizarre. So it's a L by L square, let's say. So there are 2 to the power L square configurations. Each square can be black or white. Okay? You can put it on a one-dimensional lattice if you want. You can put it on a ring. So if you have periodic boundary conditions, put it on a ring, and then you can have either black or white circles and so on. I'm not going to finish it. And the only thing you need to know is the energy of a configuration. So what is the energy of a configuration? Well, here you see, that's where physics comes. Somehow, either you try to deduce the energy from basic principles, and it's complicated, or you just, using symmetries and physical insight, you just give a formula for the energy, saying that this should be the relevant interactions. And as you certainly know, the formula for the energy taken for the Ising model, so it's an effective energy. So beta is 1 over kT. So this is a dimensionless energy, is there are two constants, J. I'm going to explain the notations just after. And this is the magnetic field divided by kT. Okay, so you sum over neighboring spins or neighboring circles, white and black circles, multiply by a constant. And here you sum all of them and multiply by another constant. And so I'm changing the language. But what you say is that this thing is +1 if the, how can I call that? The disks are of the same type. And -1 if they are different. So what you do here is you look at a configuration. So suppose I filled all of them and so on. And you look at nearest neighbor pairs. So these are nearest neighbors. They are nearest neighbors. But suppose that these are not considered to be nearest neighbors. You can if you wish. Again, it does not change much. But we just consider nearest neighbors like that or like that, these two. And then you look how many pairs you have of the same type. So this is the same type pair. This is the same type pair. And this is a pair of different types. And you put a +1 for pairs of the same type and -1 for pairs which are not of the same type. And you compute the energy like that. Okay? So it's just a purely combinatorial. I mean, physics has been completely eliminated now. It's a purely combinatorial game. And so you can calculate. Now you can apply the statistical physics theory, statistical physics procedure, and you can calculate exactly this object. In fact, this is the key object, because once you have this partition function, you can reconstruct free energy and thermodynamics. So the person who did that, well, a few persons tried. So in one dimension, the calculation of Z, in one dimension, it was done by Ising himself. It's an easy problem using transfer matrices. If you have not done it already, you should learn it, because it's a basic calculation. So in 1D, it's Ising and Lenz, I think. Lenz was his PhD advisor. And in 2 dimensions, so this is a masterwork by Onsager. So he did it, I don't remember the year, this was during the Second World War, maybe 42, 44? Okay, 44. Great. So Onsager did it in 44, and this was an absolutely huge breakthrough in statistical mechanics. Why? Because Onsager was able to calculate the free energy completely and to show, although there were arguments before by Piles, for example, but he was able to show that this very simple model in 2 dimensions and higher dimensions also, but he only did the calculations in 2 dimensions, he was able to show that it undergoes a phase transition. It means that if you're at very high temperature, the black and the white boxes, disks, will be distributed randomly in your system. But when you lower the temperature, there is a critical temperature under which there is a condensation which occurs, and disks of the same type aggregate. So this is a kind of, if you wish, liquid-gas transition, although it's not precisely that, it's more paramagnetic, ferromagnetic transition, but let's not enter these details. But there is a phase transition. And this was very important because at the beginning of the century, or even before the war, people were not sure whether statistical mechanics could describe phase transitions. And this was really a proof of that. So the calculation by Onsager of the Ising model, partition function, is one of the very important exact results in statistical mechanics. And in doing so, he, of course, he didn't use these words, but he showed that the Ising model is integrable. Okay? And he, in fact, developed the theory of integrability to a large extent. One important thing that I have to say, Onsager could not calculate, this is called the magnetic field. He was only able to calculate the free energy for the 2D Ising model for vanishing magnetic field. If you can do that with a non-zero magnetic field, it will be considered as a great, great breakthrough. Of course, and you know, if you can, nobody knows how to do it in 3 dimensions. So if you calculate the free energy of the Ising model in 3 dimensions, and in the same paper you solve the Riemann hypothesis, then you'll become the greatest physicist and mathematician alive, or maybe almost ever, maybe not ever, but among the very big ones. So, and I'm sure that Schumit will give you a third problem of the same kind, proving that, I don't know, that quark condensate or decondensate, or I don't know what. Okay, anyway, I was planning, but I'm slower than expected. You can find this in books if you have not seen it. Try to do the calculation in 1D if you haven't, because this is a basic exercise. I imagine most of you have seen that. And if you haven't, try at least to find, for example, in Baxter's, Ron Baxter, he's the great, great master of Bethe-Ansatz and integrable systems. He wrote a book on integrable models in equilibrium statistical mechanics. So in his book, you can find the nice formula for the free energy of the 2D Ising model. If you have not seen it, it's worth, because it's a cute formula. It's not horribly complicated. It involves some hyperbolic sines and cosines and a simple integral. And it's, yeah, I think you need to, I'm not going to write it, but it's a nice formula. Okay. One important thing here is that I have not done the calculation, but you imagine it's pure combinatorics. Okay? The point is to count the configuration and to weigh them using the Boltzmann-Gibbs canonical measure and do some combinatorics. That's why I say it's a problem mostly in mathematics. Okay? Here, although we talk about statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, there is absolutely no dynamics at all. Nothing is moving. I just put my black and my white dots on my square lattice, or any lattice I want, and I don't make them move anymore. And I just count how many pairs of neighbors are of the same type, of different type, and so on and so on. So there's something missing, because as you know, by Brownian motion and nature and so on, even equilibrium state is a dynamical state. Everything is moving, even at equilibrium. On the microscopic scale, configurations are changing, particles are moving, they're going from the left of the box to the right of the box, they are bouncing against each other. It's a highly dynamical state, although it's stationary. Okay? So we have to describe the dynamics, and we have to enter non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So what about the dynamics? So again, if we want to go to ab initio, we should go back to the Hamiltonian, whether it's a quantum mechanical or a classical Hamiltonian, and write whether Hamilton equations or Schrödinger equations for this horrible n-body problem, and try to solve it. That's not the right way to proceed, because it's too complicated. So the idea is to find some effective rules to describe the dynamics, again taking into account the basic symmetry of the problem and the basic physical intuition, but write some evolution rules which sound reasonable to us, but which are not derived from the 10 to the power 23 body Hamiltonian that we may write abstractly. So now comes again the cuisine, the hand-waving arguments. How are we going to write these dynamics? So the idea is to coin a model, to really build it as we wish. And I think there is a nice say by Einstein. I mean, we should build a simple model so that we can do something on it. But if it's too simple, it will just fall apart and tell us nothing. So, as Einstein said, well, he still says, we should try to make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. Because if it's too simple, nothing remains. So the idea is to try to build a dynamics, and there are many different possibilities. And during these lectures, we shall be considering mostly, if not only, Markov type of dynamics. So Markovian evolution that you learned the previous week, and that I'm going to review again fast, just to settle the notations. So we want a Markov dynamics on the level of the configurations. So we shall be considering continuous time Markov dynamics. So you taught them that, yeah, continuous time. Again, there are many variants. We have to choose one to work. Could be another one, but. So what we are going to say is that a configuration at the microscopic scale, configuration C, is going to evolve to another configuration C prime with a certain rate, with a certain probability rate. So you see we are now forgetting about this stationary equilibrium measure, and we are putting the dynamics on our configuration space to take into account that at microscopic scale, whether it's equilibrium or non-equilibrium, we are mainly interested in this lecture on non-equilibrium, but even in the equilibrium case, things are evolving in the microscopic scale, and they are changing all the time, and it's not reasonable to forget the time factor. So this Markov dynamics is evolution rules in the configuration space, on this huge configuration space, and you say that between time t and t plus dt, a configuration jumps, evolves, use the word you prefer, from C to C prime with a certain rate, m of C towards C prime. This is the rate, so you have to multiply it by dt to get the probability of evolution from C to C prime. Okay? Here again, there are many different possible notations. I'll show you a few of them. So this is the transition rate. Okay? Did you write it that way, or C prime C? Okay, so I'm going to use both of them. So now there is a general assumption, but you learned that already, in this Markov dynamics, is that what happens between time t and t plus dt does not depend on the previous history. Okay? So these transition rates may depend on time t. It will not be the case here. I shall take homogeneous time Markov dynamics, but they may depend on the time, but they do not depend on what happened before. So they do not depend on how you reached C from any given initial conditions at time t equal to 0. You just look at what happens at time t, you are at C, you can jump at C prime. And probably Abhishek and Sanjeev showed you kind of graph type of interpretation. So you can draw this as a graph. You have a configuration C1, which can evolve. It can evolve to different configurations, not only one. There could be different paths of going from here to here. For example, if you have a random walker, it can decide to go left or right. So you have two configurations which can come from one. So it can have many daughters, if you want to use a family type metaphor, with different rates, C1 to from C2, C1 to C3, and so on. And you can come to it from different configurations. One of these configurations could also go back to C1. So you have a very complicated graph, an extremely complicated graph. But even from this graph picture, we can deduce a few things. For example, the probability to remain in C between t and t plus dt, to remain in C, in the configuration C, is 1 minus the probability of leaving C. So it's 1 minus sum over all C prime different from C, m of C to C prime dt. I'm just subtracting all possible exit probabilities, And this defines the probability of remaining in C. So one useful notation is to define this number, which is a negative number, but it will be very useful, a diagonal term, which is minus the exit rate for any configuration. Can you read that? Okay, you probably told them that. And now what is the main equation, the master equation in Markov systems? Because you need to write an equation. What is the evolution equation of these kind of models? Well, it's the master equation, Markov equation, or rate equation. Here, again, people do not agree on names, but it's not important. The idea is that you define the probability of being at time t in a given configuration C, and you write an evolution equation for that. And the evolution equation is just a balance equation. The probability of this evolution is the probability of entering C into C from any other configuration. Minus the probability of leaving C to any other possible configuration. So this is the basic equation. It is the equivalent of Schrödinger equation for non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, and it does present so many similarities with Schrödinger equation. It's a linear equation with probabilities rather than amplitudes. It's governed by one matrix, which plays the role of the Hamiltonian. One big difference is that this matrix M, this rate matrix, which I'm going to define in a second, is not Hermitian. It doesn't have to be Hermitian. It can be almost any matrix. There are some constraints on it that I'm going to tell you about. But again, I think this is just a recapitulation of what you already saw. So what are the constraints on this matrix? Besides the fact that it has a sum. So yeah, so if I use my notation here, this is with the minus sign M of CC. So I can rewrite this equation in a much more compact way. Now it's a sum of all C prime. So C prime to C. I can include this term in the same pattern. It's much more pretty now. Okay. So the idea is to write it in a matrix form. So we have to define properly a matrix. So here again, there is a kind of convention. I mean, from one book to another, from one community to another, the convention is not the same. So I will take one convention. I hope it agrees with the one you learned the previous week. If it doesn't, well, just read things from right to left instead of reading from left to right. It's the same thing. So the convention is the following. Again, it's not important, but one has to be careful. So I define my Markov matrix. So remember I told you that the rate of going from C to C prime, I write it like that because it's very visual. But when you define the Markov matrix, you define this as being the line or the row, the horizontal index, and this one as being the vertical or the column index. So you define the matrix MCC prime by the rates of going from C to C prime. So it may look bizarre, but it's the only way of having matrices multiplying in the usual, because matrices do not commute. So if you have the usual product of multiplying matrices, it's the best way. So your Markov matrix is a big matrix. And if you look on the row corresponding to the C prime index, not as a column, and to the line corresponding to the C index, this term here will be the rate of going from C prime to C, which I have written M, C, C prime. Okay? So of course, as usual, I made it, it's correct, but it's not pedagogical. I should have written it like that. These are dummy indices anyway, so it's not a big difference. And now because of this definition of the diagonal term being equal to minus the exit rate, you can immediately check that if you sum any column of your Markov matrix, you get 0. In other terms, the line vector with only ones is a left eigenvector of your Markov matrix with eigenvalue 0. Okay? Okay, I think we don't need to know much more than that. So now we have to construct a dynamics. And what happens in the long-term limit when t goes to infinity? For good systems, non-reducible systems and so on, I'm not going to tell you that into details, but your probability measure, Pt of C, converges to a stationary value, which does not depend on time anymore. So this term vanishes. And P stat has to be in the kernel of the Markov matrix. So P stat is defined by M P stat. M applied to P stat is equal to 0. So we trivially know a left eigenvector of M, 1, 1, 1, 1, but the important physical quantity is the right eigenvector, null eigenvector of M, which is the stationary measure. Okay? In the case of equilibrium statistical mechanics, we know what P stat is. It is given by the canonical law of Boltzmann and Gibbs. So this gives you a constraint on the matrix. If you multiply the matrix M by the column vector with entries given by exponential minus E over kt, it has to vanish. So this gives you constraints on the rate you choose. But this gives you only n constraints, if n is the size of the matrix, and you have n square rates. So it's a very, very small number of constraints compared to the size of the number of total rates that you have. So it's a very tiny number. It's not enough, of course, to determine the Markov matrix. You still have a huge amount of choice to build. So for example, if you have the equilibrium Ising model with this black and white disks, you can decide that your dynamics will be, you pick a disk at random, and you decide to flip it over. If it's a black, you make it white. If it's white, you make it black. But then you have to choose the rate to do that. Or you can take two neighboring disks and flip them. Here again, all these dynamics are allowed. They have names: Glauber dynamics, Kawasaki dynamics. I'm not going to enter the details again. This is kind of standard things in equilibrium statistical mechanics. But you have choice. One thing you don't have the choice of, and this is one very, very important thing, maybe the most important thing I'm going to tell this morning. Even if you have a lot of latitude to choose the rates, Onsager, the same Onsager, has taught us that you don't have an absolute latitude to choose the rates. Beyond this constraint of having the equilibrium distribution given by Boltzmann-Gibbs, there is another very, very important constraint found by Onsager, which is called detailed balance. So this detailed balance thing is an extremely profound discovery by Onsager in the 30s. Does anybody know the exact date? I don't know, I think 31, 32, but I'm not sure. So it's much before the Ising model. And in fact, this is this thing, and not the Ising model, which gave Onsager, which earned him the Nobel Prize. From this detailed balance, he deduced some reciprocity relations, and he got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for these reciprocity relations. So we have two constraints. One is a natural one. So this is equilibrium, of course. Equilibrium statistical mechanics. We have two constraints. One is so-called trivial, but I mean, I'm not sure that Maxwell and Boltzmann and these people merit, I mean, what they have done is not trivial, of course, but this is classical. Okay, this is, so the stationary measure is the canonical measure. And the second thing, which is non-trivial, is that the rates of transition, which I, again, because I prefer to write them like that, I find it easier to remember, they have to satisfy some ratio relations. So the ratio of the rate of going from C to C prime by the rate of going from C prime to C is at equilibrium given by, so it is positive if the energy is less, divided by kT or beta. No, it's contraire. If you diminish the energy, it has to be positive. So I hope I didn't flunk the sign. The only way to remember it is that you want the ratio to be bigger when you go towards lower energies. So yeah. And this is called detailed balance. And this is a property which is not contained in thermodynamics, and it's not contained in equilibrium classical statistical mechanics, because it is a dynamical rule. So it's, you can say, the first non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, or one of the first discovery with the Brownian motion and this Einstein fluctuation dissipation laws. So this is a dynamical rule, and this is okay, Onsager in the 30s. So I don't know how much time I have left. No time. 40 minutes. Oh, great. So I have time to finish the lecture today almost. No, I'm joking. Okay, I'm not going to prove that, or am I? Did you see a proof of that already? This is rooted in time reversibility of Hamiltonian dynamics, whether quantum or classical. So this is something which really stems from time reversibility of physics, of physical laws, forgetting about beta disintegration and so on. This is really something which comes from the fact that at equilibrium, if you have a system at equilibrium, perfect gas in a box, if you make a picture, a movie of it, and you project the movie upside down, reverse time, you will not be able to say that the movie has been projected in the reverse time direction. Equilibrium is not sensitive to time direction. So I was wondering whether, okay, maybe I will leave the proof of that to some tutorial, because I don't want to spend too much time on equilibrium dynamics, but we shall talk about it later if you wish. I mean, I've prepared it. So I think it's time now to move to non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So the framework would be the same, Markovian. But if we want to consider non-equilibrium models, non-equilibrium, we have to look at processes which vary with time and which are not time reversal invariant. Okay? So things have evolved in the later years. I mean, this is old result, but people have been looking at it again and again in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And now there's a kind of consensus which has developed you have this kind of philosophical notion of equilibrium, and it's not very easy to define what equilibrium means. And you have this equation which is very precise on Markov rates or on other type of rates. Well, now I think people agree that equilibrium means that, means detailed balance. So if you have detailed balance, you are at equilibrium, okay? Whether you have Gibbs measure or not, but you are really in the framework of equilibrium physics. So now we are going to consider non-equilibrium processes, non-equilibrium systems. So we are going to break detailed balance. We are going to consider systems in which this is not true. Okay? So the simplest system for which it's not true, well, in fact, most of the processes in nature are out of equilibrium. Ourselves, life, biology is far from equilibrium. One of the simplest processes you can imagine, and this is the drawing we all draw in all our papers, you consider a bar of metal, anything which is conducting, and you put it in contact with two reservoirs, which can be at different temperatures, T1 and T2, or different electrical potentials, U1 and U2, or different chemical potentials, different densities of certain species, mu1 and mu2. And if you wait long enough, and the reservoirs are infinite, of course, you have a stationary current, which is going from the hot reservoir, I will take the temperature language most of the time, to the colder one. Okay? So you have a flow of heat current, but it can be a flow of electrical current if you have two different electrical potentials, of a flow of particle current if you have different chemical potentials, and so on and so on. Okay? So you have a stationary current which flows. And it's hard to imagine, but nowadays, this is a very simple system. In fact, you can imagine that this is somehow the simplest non-equilibrium model you can think about. There are many, suppose you have some material here with some gas or some anything you wish, some crystal, so you have some configurations, microscopic configurations. Well, there is no universal description of what's happening on the microscopic level for this system. What I mean more precisely is that even in the stationary state, where you have a stationary current going from left to right, there is no formula for the stationary measure, for the stationary sampling probability of the microscopic configurations in this system. If T1 equal to T2, we know what it is. Equal to T, it's exponential minus E over KT divided by Z. This is Boltzmann-Gibbs. But if T1 is different from T2, we don't know. I mean, is it T1 plus T2 over 2? Is it square root of T1, T2? Or anything you wish? It's none of that. There is no formula. We just, nobody knows. And maybe there's even, maybe nothing to know. Maybe there's no general formula. No, it's open, it's purely open. Okay? So you see, even such a simple situation, two heat reservoirs at different temperatures, we cannot write the equivalent of Boltzmann-Gibbs-Maxwell canonical law. If they were at the same temperature, it would be over, at least the beginning. We could start with something. Here we don't know what to start with. Okay? Of course, if the temperatures are not too different, we have all this linear response theory, Ohm's law, for example, or Fourier's law, and so on and so on. It's very important technologically. But if we ask the abstract theoretical questions, I have two values of T1 and T2, and I really want to know what is a stationary measure. No, there is no general answer to that. So there are no principles, and people are looking for a theory, and there are different approaches. And one approach, which is I think also similar to what Sanjeev and Abhishek are doing, is to look for models, look at specific descriptions at the microscopic level, and try to develop an understanding of these models. So in this series of lectures, I will be telling you mostly about one of these models and using it to study non-equilibrium processes and using the better ansatz to study that model. So that's how things will patch together. This will be an integrable model. And this model, which is playing a more and more important role in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So people who work on that model like me, we tend to say that's the Ising model for non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. But of course, you should take it with a grain of salt because everybody sees the sun above his own house. So, but this model is quite important. It's quite popular. And it's called the asymmetric simple exclusion process. So it's a very, very long name. Of course, we are not going to use it all the time. Process. So people use usually the nickname, the acronym, simple exclusion, ASAP. Okay. So it's a kind of minimal model for non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. What we want to do is to kind of mimic a dynamical Ising model, but with no detail balance, so that we are sure that even in the stationary state, we are not going to describe any equilibrium system. So I will describe it in one dimension, but you can define it in higher dimensions, although it's less interesting in higher dimensions. You have particles on the lattice. So this is a lattice, and you put particles on it. So you have lattice sites, I plus 1, and so on. Okay. I'm not going to tell you yet, we'll talk about it later, slightly later, about the boundaries, whether it's periodic, infinite, open, and so on. So you have particles on sites, and a given site can be either occupied or empty. You cannot put two particles per site. You have at most one particle per site. So people like to talk about it as fermions. If it helps, you can think of fermions, but there is no quantum mechanics involved. It's a classical model. So there is a kind of exclusion rule. Okay. At most one particle per site. So these are the configurations, and now we have to define a dynamics. And the dynamics is the following. It's a kind of random walk dynamics. A particle can jump to the left or to the right side with two different rates, p dt per time dt or q dt per time dt. But the jump is possible only if the neighboring target site is empty. For example, this particle could jump backwards, but not forward, because the site is already occupied. Okay? And because we are in continuous time, and there is this dt infinitesimal factor, you have only at most one jump occurring per time. Otherwise, you will have dt squared, and this is negligible. So you have one jump attempted for each dt, and this jump can be successful if the target site is empty, or it can be a failure if the target site is already occupied. This defines Markov dynamics on your model. And usually, well, there are many cases, we take P bigger than Q. So there will be a current, an overall global current driven from left to right. And this condition will break detail balance. Okay? Because you will have a stationary current driven in your system, and the current will be in one direction, and if you make a movie of it and you project it backwards, you will see that the current is reversed, and this will tell you that something is wrong. It's not reversible, so it's breaking detail balance. So it's a minimal model, and because it's a minimal model, it has appeared in many different contexts. the first people who really developed it in the 60s were biologists, in fact. They were studying the motion of proteins on RNA, okay, or enzymes on RNA. And RNA is a one-dimensional chain, and these enzymes are going one before the other, and they cannot overtake each other. So it's a kind of exclusion process. And then it appeared in many, many contexts, in solid ionic conductivity, in you can think about any low-dimensional, very constrained dynamics where you have some kind of geometric hindrance. Particles cannot overcome each other, like in molecular motors, again in biophysics. This kind of model will become useful and relevant. And one popular application at our scale of this kind of models is traffic flow. So you have many elaborate models of traffic flows in real cities like Geneva, which are built on variants of this ASAP. Okay, but I'm not going to talk at all about applications. So this model is very popular in mathematics also, because if you go to a continuous lattice, you take many, many tiny small intervals, what are you going to see? You're going to see each particle will become a random walker, will become a Brownian motion. So you will see a line of Brownian motions which are not allowed to overcome each other, to pass each other. So these are interacting Brownian motions, okay? And this is the simplest generalization of the one-body Brownian motion you can think about, interacting Brownian motions with just a kind of delta function reflection interaction. And this was, in fact, imagined by a mathematician in the end of the 60s, I think, called Spitzer. So he was a pure probabilist, a mathematician, and he was interested in Brownian motion, a big master of Brownian motion, and he thought about this generalization of Brownian motion. So one possible continuous limit of the ASAP is this interacting Brownian motion problem. And the big master of this exclusion process, there are many big masters, but one of the great mathematicians who has worked on it and is still working on it is this American-Indian mathematician, Varadhan, who won the Abel Prize. And he worked a lot on the exclusion process, especially because he was interested in the hydrodynamic limit of the exclusion process. As you probably know, one of the big open mathematical problems in applied mathematics is how you can deduce the Navier-Stokes or the Euler equations, starting from Newtonian mechanics at the level of particles. So you start with Newtonian laws for each of the particles of your liquid, and by coarse-graining this thing, you should be able to deduce from it Navier-Stokes or Euler equations. And this has not been possible. This is a big program that has been started by Hilbert himself at the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a great mathematical congress in Paris, and Hilbert gave, I don't know, something like 20, 25 open problems for the next century, for the 20th century, and many of them have been solved, not all of them. And one of the open problems was, how can you construct mathematically the Navier-Stokes and the Euler equations starting from microscopic dynamics? How can you deduce the macroscopic, the effective fluid dynamics equations, knowing the microscopic laws? And this would shed light on turbulence and all these things also. And nobody has been able to do that. And the only system for which it has been done, and it was done by Varadhan in the late 80s, is the exclusion process. So Varadhan was able to do rigorously the hydrodynamic limit for the exclusion process using both very elaborate probabilistic methods and analysis. And he was able to deduce the hydrodynamic, the Euler equation for the flow described by the exclusion process. And in fact, the corresponding equation is Burger's equation that you probably have met already. Burger's equation is a kind of, it's a simple equation, but something like that. the density, the flow of the density of this exclusion process is given. There's a constant here, something like that. And there is some effective viscosity, if you wish. Okay, so deducing a hydrodynamic equation starting from a microscopic model is a huge problem, very important. And the only thing I want to say is that Varadhan did it for the ESA. And if you're interested, you can find on the web a very nice descriptive article by Varadhan called The Complex Story of Simple Exclusion. Fun, in 1996. So he has written, of course, many technical papers, but this paper is quite readable about the exclusion process. Okay. So now we still have a little time. So this is a Markov process. And of course, to finish the game, I have to tell you about boundary conditions. So there are plenty of boundary conditions one can consider. And one simple boundary condition is just to put it on a periodic lattice, so on a periodic ring. And you jump rate P in the positive direction, trigonometric, Q in the negative direction, and as before you have exclusion and so on. So I think if you really want to understand what's going on, a good exercise, trivial but good, would be to write the Markov matrix. So I'm not going to do it, but you should try it. Write the Markov matrix for the AZ on a ring. On a ring, so there are L sites. And of course, on the ring, the number of particles is conserved, n particles. So on a ring with L equal to 4 sides and 2 particles. It's a 6 by 6 matrix. And if you're able to write it, it means you understand the rules. It's always difficult to describe the rules in words. Everybody finds it difficult the first time to understand what's going on. So if you're able to write this matrix, or even simpler, L equal to 3, N equal to 2, it's a 3 by 3 matrix. If you're able to write the Markov matrix, you have understood what's going on. Okay, for a periodic exclusion process, for the periodic case, the stationary measure is very simple. All configurations, so how many configurations are there? The number of configurations is just a binomial. You have to put n particles on L sides. So it's just this binomial, which is L factorial, n factorial, L minus n factorial. Okay? And it's very simple in the periodic case. Each configuration has the same probability. It's flat. Okay? So it's just 1 over Ln. So this is also a good exercise to try to prove it. Again, it's not completely trivial, but it's a good exercise to test your understanding. Okay? So it doesn't mean that the periodic case is trivial, but at least the stationary measure is very simple. There will be non-trivial questions about the exclusion process on the periodic lattice later on. Okay, the other case, which is interesting, but very complicated, in fact, is the infinite system. So the infinite system will be, the line, the infinite line. So the stationary measure is quite simple. So on the infinite line, where should I write it? Maybe there. On the infinite line, the stationary measure is quite easy to state, but complicated to prove mathematically, not so complicated physically. The infinite line, the stationary measure is what the mathematicians called a Bernoulli measure. Is at each site, you decide to put a particle with a probability rho, and you don't put a particle with probability 1 minus rho, and you do it independently from one side to another. Okay? So it's a product, so the product of independent 1-0 measures of independent the stationary measure is a product of independent Bernoulli 0, 1 measures. So occupied, I is occupied with probability rho, and empty with -1 minus rho. Independent is with a E or with a A? E. In French it's with a A, and I'm always confused. Okay, so I is occupied with rho and empty with 1 minus rho. And you do it independently. So mathematicians call it a Bernoulli measure, nu rho, and the stationary measure is the product of the Bernoulli measures. Okay, so this is again a simple statement. Each site is occupied or empty with this probability, the same everywhere, and this is invariant by the dynamics. This is the stationary measure. Now let's come to something slightly more complicated. No, before I start that, I want to tell you something, and then we really start the funny things, the amusing things. Yeah, I want to tell you that. Okay, for the so this is the name of this measure. I mean, this process of putting with probability rho and not putting with 1 minus rho, mathematicians call it a measure. It's like a 0, 1. It's a Bernoulli measure, and they usually note it by a nu rho. Don't worry, it's just pedantic. Okay. This is stationary for every rho, yeah, and for every P and Q. So of course you have to choose that a priori. This gives you the overall density of the model. Okay, one nice result we shall not discuss about more than that, but I want to tell it to you because it's an important physical result. If you take the infinite system, there's one special case which is called the symmetric case, where particle can jump in both directions with the same rates, P equal to Q equal to 1. Okay? So it's not breaking detailed balance. It's not really out of equilibrium in the formal sense, but nevertheless, it's an interesting case. So, yeah, you can map it to a kind of Hubbard model, tight bending if you wish, or you can even map it to a spin chain. But I prefer, then it's a question of, yeah, you're right. But I prefer to remain purely classical, maybe because I'm not taught enough or well enough in quantum mechanics. But you really don't need to talk about, but if you like quantum mechanics, you can think it in quantum mechanical terms, but this is a classical model of particles hopping. This is the simplest generalization of the random walk, if you wish. You have many random walkers, and they don't want to sit together. So it's a very simple model. In the symmetric case, there's one important result. Suppose I have many particles in this infinite system, and I tag one. I look at one, which initially was at site number 0, and then it moves, okay? And I look at it for a long time, and I decide to monitor its position. So I call x of t the position of the tracer. xt is a tracer position. Tracer position. So of course, on average, like a random walker, average of xt is 0. Okay, you agree with that? But what is the variance of xt? So do you have any idea of that? What would be the variance of a random walker if it were alone, with no interactions? It would be linear in time, of course, yeah, dt. Well, here the nice result is that x squared varies as square root of t. So it's not t, it's square root of t. So I don't remember the pi's and the factor 2's, and I will put them carefully. I think this is the formula, but there may be a factor 2 somewhere. No, it's okay. So x squared is in square root of t. So the typical value of x is the fourth root of t. So this is subdiffusive. So yeah, again, when we exactly. So you have to yes, but if it's dense enough, if you have half density, one half, then you will not really see the short time behavior. So you're right, of course, if it's very, what's the opposite of dense? Rare, yeah. If you have very few particles, if it's very rare, then this random walker will live his life without seeing the other guys. So he will diffuse linearly, and once he starts interacting, you have this crossover. So this is an important result, especially because it's seen in experiments and in single file diffusion. So this is the big single file diffusion domain. I think last year or 2 years ago, Metzler gave a lecture here, and he's working a lot with his colleagues, with his Israeli colleagues, for example, Barkai and so on this single file diffusion, using techniques that I'm not very fan of, but anyway, but okay. But the thing is that experimentally, you see that, okay? So it's an important result because it slows down diffusion very significantly. Okay, so there's a third type of boundary conditions, which is much closer to this initial drawing of the pipe between two reservoirs that I showed you at the beginning of this chapter, is a finite system of exclusion, but from site 1 to L, a finite model with particles which are hopping or not, so on. And here you put two reservoirs of particles, and you can have particles which enter from the left. I will give you the details later, or we can jump out. And here the same. So you have two boundaries with reservoirs, infinite reservoirs, which can give and take particles from the system, and the exclusion process with P and Q, P bigger than Q, inside. So you have now two sources of non-equilibrium. The fact that P is different from Q, so it drives particles from left to right, but also the boundary rates. Even if P and Q were equal here, if you had a lot of probability of rate of putting particles here and not taking, and here extracting but not putting, you will have an overall current. And this would be, that's what people believe, a good model for this pipe drawing between two reservoirs. So it's a kind of, again, Ising or microscopic model which represents well this pipe paradigm that I drew at the beginning, T1, T2, and so on. Okay? So this is one of the models we are going to concentrate upon. And the idea is that the techniques used for this model, for the periodic model, and for the infinite model are quite different. The techniques used for the infinite model are very similar to the ones that Satya is going to describe to you, random matrix theory, Freedom determinant, and so on. For this periodic model, finite model, Bethe-Ansatz is a very, very useful tool. So we are going to use this model to learn the Bethe-Ansatz. And for this model, it's a mixture between Bethe-Ansatz and another technique, which is called the matrix product ansatz, which I'm going to tell you about now. If I still have 10 minutes, roughly. So I'm going to start telling you about that now. So let's take, so in this game of solving exactly models, simple models, you have to somehow, it's like, doing some climbing. You have to find a path. You have to find something to break down the, like burglars, you have to enter the model. So that's what happened 20 years ago already. This model, if we wait long enough, it will reach a stationary state with stationary probabilities. So we have L sites. How many configurations do we have? 2 to the power L. Each site can be either occupied or empty. So I have 2 to the power L configurations. Of course, I don't say what's happening in the reservoirs. I'm only interested in my system, which is from 1 to L. So I have 2 to the power L configurations. Okay. So let's take a system of size 2. So my system of size 2, 2 sites, 1 and 2. They can be both empty. So I write it 0, 0. This one can be empty, this one occupied. 0, 1, occupied, empty. 1, 0, and 1, 1. And so on and so on. If I have 3 sites, I will have 8 configurations, and so on and so on. Okay, you would agree with that? So so the stationary measure, P stat, in the infinite time limit, it is unknown. Okay? It's not given by any Maxwell-Boltzmann. There is no Hamiltonian here. There is no temperature. There is nothing. Okay. So the question is, how can you calculate this stationary measure for the exclusion process? And the people who did it for the first time, it was 20 years ago, roughly, in 94, are Derrida, Evans, Hakim, and Pasquier. So most of them were in Saclay at that time, and this was in 94, 93, 94. And that trick that they built to solve this model exactly, it was a trick at that time. It has become a kind of method, and it was considered as a breakthrough, a big breakthrough. So I'm going to try to teach you that. It's a kind of very strange, very beautiful, but very strange way of writing things. But before I'm going to teach it, I'll probably teach it tomorrow. I was planning to do it today, but I will give you the secret. So the problem is that this is filmed. So because, of course, people don't like to tell the recipe for getting the result, but I'm going to tell it to you because I think it's beautiful. Yeah, it's really beautiful, and I think it's okay. I think we are here to teach you techniques, to teach you physics, but possibly also to teach you ways of doing physics, ways of solving problems which are not solved. And this is a fantastic way of solving a problem which was open for many years. And well, it's all these people, but the way I'm going to teach you, to show you how it was done, was first done by Bernard Derrida. And he was able to break the problem, to break the code in a very beautiful way. So first of all, this is a complicated problem, already too complicated, because particles can jump backward, forward, they can enter from the left, from the right, they can exit. So we are going to simplify it extremely. We are going to consider the totally asymmetric exclusion process. Particle can only jump to the right with rate 1. So if the right side is empty, one particle in dt can jump. Okay? Particles can only enter from the left, again with rate 1. And particles can only exit from the right, again with rate 1. All the rates are equal to 1. You see, there could be 6 rates. P, Q, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Okay, out of the 6, 3 are killed, and the other ones are taken equal to 1. So this is a very simple model. And for example, you see this configuration, a particle can enter, so it can go to this one. And you can draw the graph. This configuration, this particle can move forward. It will go to this one. This configuration, either the particle can leave and it will go to this one, or another particle can enter, it will go to this one, and so on and so on. So again, another nice exercise is to write the Markov matrix for this model, 4x4 matrix. Choose this order and just write the 4x4 matrix. And the stationary measure is going to be the kernel of this 4x4 matrix. Okay? So you have to solve the 4x4 equation, M, P1, P2, P3, P4, where P1, P2, P3, P4 are the stationary measure the stationary probabilities of these 4 configurations is equal to 0. 4 by 4 system, you can solve it by hand. Okay? Then you go to 3 sites, 8 by 8 system. You can solve it by Mathematica. And you can go to systems up to size 8 or 10, if you wish. And you will have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 numbers. So that's what Bernard Derrida did. He did it without Mathematica at that time, I think, probably by hand or using some Fortran program. He did it for size 1. For size 1, it's trivial. I have only 2 configurations. And he found that they're both equiprobable, 1/2, 1/2. So 1/2, 1/2. Okay, the denominator is the same, so I just write the denominator here. So it's 1/2, 1/2. Okay? Then he did it for size 3, 4, 2, sorry. So, and he found that it's 1/5, 1/5, 2/5, 1/5. So these are the weights. And the denominator is 5. It should add up to 1. Do you follow the game? Okay? Yes? Repeat? Okay. So if you try to find, by solving the Markov matrix, the stationary probabilities of this system with 2 sites, there are 4 configurations, and you will find that this configuration appears with the probability 1/5, this one 1/5, this one 2/5, and this one 1/5. Okay? Now I go to the 3 sites, so 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. I think I'm not going to write all of them, or maybe I will. 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. So 8 numbers, sorry. And they are given by 1/14. But I don't write the 14. I don't write the denominator. 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1/14. So this configuration has a probability 1/14, this one 1/14, 2/14, 1/7, and so on and so on. And you can do that up to size 7, 8, or 10. And look at these numbers. So forget about the denominator. Because we like to think about integers, so we can just write the denominator apart. So the denominators are given by 2, 5, 14. The next denominator will be 42, then 132, then 429, then 1430, I think, and so on and so on. Do you know what these numbers are? Have you ever met them? Anybody? No? They don't sound familiar? Okay, these numbers are in fact a series of numbers which are very popular in combinatorics or in any probability. These numbers 1, 2, 5, 14, 42, and the 32, they are called the Catalan numbers. And they count the number of binary trees. If you want to build trees, so for example a tree, something like that, and if you want to count how many binary trees you have with 3 leaves, you will have 2 of them, and then you will have 5 like that, and so on, because you can put this thing here, here, this thing here, or here, and so on and so on. So these are the trees with 3 leaves. There are 2 of them. There are 5 trees with 4 leaves, and so on and so on. So these numbers have a nice combinatorial interpretation. So this was already a first observation. They were very happy to see that the denominators are not crazy numbers. Look, that's exactly what Satya said an hour or 2 ago. We are looking at hints of integrability, hints of solvability. So we have to examine systems and to look at some patterns, some regularities. So this is already a very nice regularity. And then, again, the same people, they looked now at the numbers, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, these numbers, the next ones for size 4, and so on. And they found something. In fact, they found some patterns, and they found even so many patterns that they were able to construct all these numbers directly without having to solve the problem. They just understood, okay, this has to be 3, this has to be 2. So you see, it's a kind of a IQ game, if you wish, or kind of, Sudoku game. But that's really the game they played at the beginning. So maybe I think it's a good place to stop almost. Maybe I can leave you with that. Or maybe I can give you the next ones if you really want to, or in the tutorial, if you really want to think about it. But because here there's not enough information. There is information, but not enough. If you have the next ones, you will have enough informations. And then you can try to think how to construct all these numbers. So it will be 1, so on. So, I mean, this is just a recipe, of course, and this is just for fun. We are not going to do that more than that. It's just to tell you how they were able to break through. Because the solution, when I will give it to you, it will look to you a bit strange, artificial. Why? Where does it come from? Well, it really comes from examining these numbers very precisely. Okay? So maybe I can at least tell you a bit some things. You see, for example, these 4 numbers, they are here. Okay? Now if I write in the next 16 numbers, the 8 first numbers will be the same as these ones. Okay? But of course, the 8 last ones will be something different. So what does it mean that these 4 numbers are the same as these ones? Well, these 4 numbers, they are just obtained by putting a 0 on the left. So it means that if you add a 0 on the left, and it will be true also here, empirically, and true in the next, adding a 0 to the left does not change the number. Now if you look at it more carefully, you can see that adding a 1 to the right does not change the number either. If you add a 1 to the right, it's the same as this one. So this gives you 75% of the numbers already. If you know what's happening at a given size, you can deduce 75% of the numbers at the size above it. Do you follow me? Okay. So you're able to eliminate all the zeros to the left and all the ones to the right. It is a kind of very non-reducible, because the ones are to the left and zeros to the right. So I cannot use my observations that I just told you. But then the next observation, which is the crucial one, is that if you have the pattern 1, 0 somewhere, 1, 0, you see this is 6. And it looks like a very strange way of doing things, but not so much. For example, I've been spending the last few weeks looking at much more complicated number for a much more complicated system. And when you find the pattern, you're able to integrate the model and to find how it works. Just to end with a little story, Onsager found the solution of the 2D Ising model. And it's a story I didn't check in, but I think it's true. When he died, they found in his papers hundreds of sheets of papers, of scrap papers, where he was solving the Ising model for 2x2 square lattices, 3x3, 4x4, by hand, by doing the combinatorics, till he found the complete pattern and was able to solve the general case. So I know it's a very special business of trying to solve models exactly. Most of you are not going to enter this kind of very bizarre way of doing science, but the method is useful. I mean, try to find a very simple model and look at special cases. And usually, if there is any harmony or any pattern, this special case will reveal them to you, and you'll be able, if you persist enough, to solve the general case. It often works like that. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you.